As you can tell, and from the Ed puzzle that we started off with today, we're going to be looking at the Holocaust in terms of the complicity of the United States. And here I put a question mark for a couple of reasons. One, it is a question. Was the United States complicit in the Holocaust? I don't want you to think that this is some kind of blame America first kind of lesson, but we do want to explore the questions of whether the United States was complicit, or at least if it could have done more than it did to help the Jews. So this is part 6 of our Holocaust unit and the final part. Just a refresher, remember, complicity means failing to stop or even helping someone taking an illegal, harmful, or immoral action. What we're going to really focus here on more is the failing to stop rather than the U.S. helping the Nazis to conduct the Holocaust. But in important ways, the U.S. government and perhaps the public, who are responsible for electing the top leaders in the United States government, were complicit because they didn't do as much as they could have to save Europe's Jews. Two main tasks here. We are going to focus on A, and only A today. You're going to complete these notes using the in-class presentation. If you miss something, there will be a recording of this. That's why I'm recording it right now for later. So please pick up with your notes right here. Section A, what the U.S. did and what the U.S. could have done. So part of what we are going to consider driving U.S. actions here is racism and anti-Semitism. Played a big role in why the U.S. did not do more. And our starting point here is going to be an argument from a recently deceased political scientist named Bruce Russett. He was writing a book that argued that depending on really how you thought of World War II, it was a war that didn't actually benefit the United States, and he thought that there were good reasons that the U.S. Should have stayed out of World War II, which was a controversial argument. He was making it during the era of the Vietnam War, and so he was just kind of trying to spark a debate about America's choices of wars. And one of the issues he takes on is the role of World War II, U.S. involvement in the Holocaust. And he said, looking back on the evidence of World War II, and looking back on how Americans at the time he was writing thought about the war, there was a common belief that the U.S. had to fight. And it had an obligation to fight, to stop the Holocaust, and to save Europe's Jews. And Noah, if you want to swing around here so it's easier to see, you're welcome to do that. Of course, there are other reasons the U.S. fought World War II. The one that probably jumps to mind first for most of you is the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. He's thinking about it from that other moral obligation on the part of the United States, not just to defend itself in the case of being attacked by the Japanese, but the humanitarian cause of stopping the Holocaust and saving the Jews. But Russett said those people were wrong. And not because the Holocaust shouldn't have been stopped or Europe's Jews shouldn't have been saved, but because the U.S. actions really didn't stop, much less prevent the Holocaust. The U.S. got into the war too late to really stop the Holocaust. I mean, remember, the Japanese attack us in December of 1941. The earliest the United States is going to get into the war is 1942. And the Holocaust, a lot of it is happening in Nazi-controlled territory that the U.S. is not going to liberate. None of its allies will liberate until 6 million Jews have been killed. And second, and related to the first, being too late, the U.S. didn't fight the war with the Holocaust as its main objective, right? As stopping the Holocaust as its main objective. Remember, the invasion to bring down the Nazis and really get at the German homeland doesn't happen until June of 1944, and it happens at Normandy, France. A lot of the Holocaust is happening on the other side, right, of Germany. Normandy is kind of close. It's up there. Right? It allows you to get at Western Germany, but a lot of the Holocaust is happening in Poland or the East. Okay, so we didn't fight the war in a way that was meant to get to and save the Jews first. And he argues, really, if America wanted to save the Jews from the Holocaust, it had a pretty easy way of doing that. It didn't need to go fight anybody. It didn't need to conquer any territory. He said all the U.S. needed to have done was provide the Jews with a refuge in America. Right? Just let them in. And as you saw in the case of the St. Louis, the U.S. quite often did not let them in. And it wasn't alone. And other countries, as you saw, turned them away too. Thing is, the U.S. once had been a refuge for persecuted Jews. Before the First World War, the United States government recognized that Jews were a persecuted group. We've seen that before. You had that political cartoon of Teddy Roosevelt lecturing the Tsar about all of the horrible ways that he was oppressing and persecuting Russian Jews. And this political cartoon portrays Uncle Sam as, it's even called, the modern Moses, parting the seas to let the Jews escape to a new promised land, the United States. And this fit with the general story of U.S. policy on immigration up to World War I. Until the First World War, the United States federal government put no general restrictions on the number of immigrants that could come to the United States. And so numbers were huge. I know if some of you have been paying attention to immigration news in the United States right now, there are a lot more than 1.2 million people trying to get into the U.S. in recent years. But remember, now we've got in excess of 330 million people in this country. Back in this time period, the population is much smaller. So in terms of proportion, the U.S. was much more open to immigration before World War I. And so millions upon millions of people are coming from Europe. Of the Europeans who immigrated, not most, but many of them were European Jews. Which means the population of Jews living in America really grows rapidly. This chart helps us see it. From 1890, there were 875,000 Jews living in America. Right, by 1930, just a few years before Hitler takes power in Germany, there are 4.25 million. Right? And as the creator of this graph showed, a lot of these are coming from Eastern Europe. As a lot of these, they're not Germany's Jews yet. They're Jews that are trying to escape the Russians, for example, in the pogroms. But in 1924, the United States government sets important new limits on who can come to the United States and how many. These are what are known as the country and regional quotas. And they're divided up in these categories. Now, at this time, if you notice what's missing, Latin America, Canada, those aren't included. People could move to the United States freely from Latin America or come across from Canada. These restrictions focus on places outside of the Americas. Now, these country and regional quotas were made on purpose. Now, in your notes, you have that graph that you can look at. The vast majority of people allowed to come to the United States were from Northern or Western Europe. This was on purpose, right? And then Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, Asia, Africa, immigration from there was restricted for racist reasons. The idea was to keep, quote, America's racial stock from being contaminated by undesirable immigrants. And this, so some Europeans are part of this. Southern Europeans were often considered undesirable. Groups like the Italians, Africans, Asians. There were really important restrictions on Asians, and some of them, of course, before 1924. You're going to learn that next year in your American history class. And included in there are Jews. And this is not by accident. Anti-Semitism was common and was openly accepted in United States society, shown in images like this political cartoon. Oddly enough, from the exact same magazine as the Modern Moses political cartoon we saw just a few minutes ago. And so in this, we see a stereotypical and anti-Semitic portrayal of Jews. Okay? They are shown as wealthy. They are shown with stereotypical physical features. And they are portrayed as, despite being wealthy, being very cheap and not wanting to spend their money. I mean, this is meant to be in an accent, but Mr. What does it cost to go in the water? Clearly the portrayer is, or the artist is portraying them by all kinds of stereotypes that he can put into one cartoon. This is another political cartoon that shows the same thing. This man is portrayed as Jewish. He kind of represents the things the United States does not want from Eastern Europe. Let's skip ahead to 1933. Hitler has taken power in Germany and has started early on persecuting Jews. Lots of Jews see what's going to happen and try to leave. But during this time period, only 1.5% of all of the Germans trying to get into the United States are actually allowed in. There should have been more, but a lot of them didn't have enough money to come to the United States. Not that they couldn't afford tickets, but the United States said, look, even if we're going to let you in, you have to show us that you have enough money to support yourself. Right? Because, as this political cartoon shows, the United States does not want the baggage of poverty coming into the country. After this point in time, most of the Germans who are not getting in, but are on a waiting list to get in, were Jewish. In the earlier years of Hitler's reign, 1934 to 1937, the average size of the waiting list was 88,714. 1938, when we have the Anschluss, and Germany makes Austria part of Germany. Annexation means the list jumped to 139,163. In 1939, how about that? The U.S. did allow more people to enter into the United States, but the number trying to get here increased, and so the waiting list hits almost 250,000 people. This is just the waiting list from Germany, by the way. This isn't everywhere. It now includes Austria, but German Jews. Annexed. ANNEXED. By 1940, the waiting list is over 300,000. But, 1939, and in the late summer of that year, World War I starts. The war makes it harder, and then after 1941, it becomes increasingly difficult for Jews to get here. One of the problems has nothing to do with the United States and what it's doing. When Hitler conquered territory, he shut down U.S. offices like consulates that would have allowed people to come and apply to go to the United States, to get a visa to go to the United States. Now, on the American side, the government also made it harder. It simply canceled the waiting list and much more strictly limited immigration from Germany, which may seem an odd thing. If so many people are trying to get here, why does the U.S. make it harder? At this point, the U.S. is concerned about Nazi spies trying to sneak in, Nazi saboteurs, people who might come here and blow stuff up in preparation for a Nazi attack. We want to keep those out. And there were definitely, there weren't just people trying to get in here. There were German Americans in the United States who were rabid Nazis. And some of them joined up and went over to Germany and served in the SS that you learned about earlier. So the U.S. didn't want to bring any more potential spies or saboteurs. And remember, the U.S. is pretty paranoid about this stuff. Think about on the other side of the country, we're locking up Japanese in what we call internment camps. Japanese Americans in what we call internment camps that aren't all that different from concentration camps. We're just not doing the mass killing part. We are providing food. So the U.S. is a bit paranoid about these things. And then especially after the United States becomes one of the belligerent countries fighting in the war, happens in 1942, immigration to the United States is essentially impossible. Allowed. A-L-L. No, just allowed. A-L-L-O-W-E-D. And I know the U.S. declares war earlier, but it takes a while to get mobilized and actually start fighting. So 1942 is the date we want to think about. And I'll put this slide back up when we get to the end if anybody still needs that. And remember, when we've been talking about who gets in, we've been focused solely on Germany and Austria once it's made part of Germany. We're not talking until now about Eastern European Jews, Jews from especially places like Poland. They never had much of a chance of getting away from the Nazis by coming to the United States. Because if you look at the quota, only 12.4% of people are going to be allowed from Southern and Eastern Europe combined. So if we have even smaller quotas, at the best, you're going to have a longer waiting list. Those people aren't going to get here. And because of the way the Nazis brutally ruled in occupied Eastern Europe, it was even harder for Jews to get out. Remember, as we've seen, they get, in many cases, rounded up very quickly and sent to death camps or mobile killing centers or concentration camps for forced labor. So there's just not much chance for them to get away. But, and I do want to be very clear about this, we're also going to consider later some arguments that kind of the usual story of the MS St. Louis has some big flaws. But even before we get to that, I want to point out that the United States still did a lot to help, even if some of it might have been too late. In 1944, a man who was the Secretary of the Treasury at the time, Henry Morgenthau, personally persuaded the President of the United States to create something called the War Refugee Board. Secretaries of the Treasury, they're about the money, but they end up kind of being involved in a lot of other stuff. You go up to the post office in Savannah, you're going to see Henry Morgenthau's name on that post office because the U.S. Postal Service, the Treasury were very much linked at that time. The War Refugee Board tried to help in several ways and by working with different kinds of organizations. So it would have worked with Jewish organizations, maybe organizations that were very much focused on just Holocaust survivors, maybe Zionist organizations. There were also countries in Europe that managed to be neutral and stay out of the war. Countries like Sweden, for example, or Switzerland. And the U.S. would try to work with diplomats from those countries to find ways to help Jews. There were also armed European resistance groups, like the ones that you learned about earlier that helped to kill Reinhard Heydrich in Prague. As these kind of underground armed groups. With these different organizations, the U.S. tried to rescue Jews in Nazi-occupied territory. Right, so get them out if you can. If you can't get them out, you can at least maybe provide things like food, clothing, other necessities to Jews who are hiding, right, so that they can continue to hide. The WRB is also important because it was not just the first part of the American government, but in a lot of ways, kind of the first source of information to the public about the mass killings that were happening at the Auschwitz concentration camp. And remember, that largely came about because one man, granted a powerful man, the Secretary of the Treasury, convinced the President of the United States that this was an important thing to do. Still, we know the U.S. could have done more to help the Jews escape the Nazis. We know that U.S. law and immigration policies did a lot to reduce Jews' chances of escaping to the United States. But to put some of this in numbers in terms of what the United States did do, it let in between 180,000 and 220,000 European refugees, mostly Jews. Unfortunately for the Eastern European Jews, such as the ones from Poland, most of these that got in were from Central and Western Europe. Places like Germany, places like the Netherlands. And that was more than other countries. So even if the U.S. didn't do enough, it still did more than others, and it still did do quite a bit. So why did it take the U.S. so long to help? So one reason is that Americans were really not taking Hitler and the Nazis that seriously. For one thing, they certainly didn't see it as a problem that should concern Americans. This was a problem for Europe. And it took a lot of convincing. And one of the people who did a lot of the effort to convince them was Dr. Seuss. And so we're going to see a series of Dr. Seuss cartoons as we work through this. Right? He's trying to warn Americans, hey, look, Hitler sure looks like he could become an American problem once he's finished with Europe. Second reason, lots of the American public, right, ordinary Americans and American leaders, were focused on America's problems. We're still fighting our way out of the Great Depression, and World War I had become really unpopular in the United States. A lot of people viewed it as a huge mistake. And the last thing we want to do is get involved in another one of these European wars. And so Dr. Seuss, again, tries to come in here and make Americans care a bit more. Okay, and the third reason, anti-Semitism is still a barrier to the U.S. doing something to help the Jews. This political cartoon kind of blames some of the trouble on two famous Americans at the time, Charles Lindbergh and Gerald P. Nye. Now, Lindbergh, you guys have probably heard about. He was from Missouri. He was one of those St. Louis Germans. We have a school in St. Joe named after him, but he was very much a pro-Nazi anti-Semite. And that's why he made his way into two of these Dr. Seuss cartoons. Now, when we come back to this packet, which we won't do tomorrow on Friday, we'll do on Monday, you're going to analyze the changing messages about Jews in Europe and about the Nazis over the course of the Holocaust, and how these changed American public opinion and the actions of U.S. leaders. And that's where we're going to stop there. We've got a few minutes if you want to continue to work on the Ed puzzle. If you need me to go back to another slide, I will put that up now. Yeah, let me go back there. Is that the one you need? Or okay. Yeah, there you go. Anybody need any of the other slides put back up? There you go. And if you're finished with that ed puzzle, and I can see some of you are already doing this, and that's awesome, work on yesterday's geography assignment.